Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, all about the motherboards. So just remember that I'm going to ask you to take a few notes, and when you're done, just upload them as homework. All right, so let's get started. And so the first decisions to make when you are building a computer is you have to decide what type of motherboard to have and what type of CPU, of course. So, for example, the LGA 1151 socket can hold Core i7, i5, i3, or even the old Pentium processors. Okay, so let's take a look at what are a form factor. I want you to write this down. A form factor is the one that determines the size and what type of power supply you are going to use. So that's very important. And there are three types of form factors. There's the ATX, the micro ATX, and the mini ATX. So what you see up here is the mini ATX. Okay, so smaller version of the motherboard. And there they are. You have their sizes, the mini, depending on the tower that you are going to get, the micro, and the full ATX. All right, another thing that I want you to write down on the motherboards, there are a whole bunch of chipsets. So what is a chipset? Write this down. Chipset is a set of chips on the motherboard that works closely with the processor to collectively control the memory, buses on the motherboard, and some peripherals. Also, you need to know what a socket is. A socket is a rectangular with pins and pads to connect the processor to the motherboards and a mechanism to hold the processor in place. So here is a typical socket. This is the LGA 1151. Okay, and there's another. Okay, so here are the Intel sockets, which you should be familiar with. The Intel sockets include the LGA 1151. That's the latest and the greatest. Then you have the older ones, LGA 1150, LGA 1155, the 266, the LGA 2011, and the LGA 1366, right? Then you got the advanced micro devices, AMD chipsets and socket. They include the TR4, AM4, and the AM3s. AM3 Plus, actually, I guess. All right. So to make sure you always make sure that you always match the processor and the socket on the motherboard. Don't just purchase any CPU and or think that it's going to fit on the motherboard and the socket. So you got to double check what kind of motherboard you have, what kind of socket you have. Then you may be able to update or upgrade, or if you're purchasing a new CPU, start from there. All right, so now we need to talk about the buses and the expansion slots that are on the motherboard. So what is a bus? That's the first thing you need to know. So I want you to write this down. But a bus is a circuit or a path that enables data, instructions, timing signals, and power to move from one component to another. So you can write it, I think it starts down here somewhere, that definition. So please write that down. That's an actual line, a physical line that's connected. Sometimes you call that traces. So you probably can't see them, but it's in here that connects these on the flip side of the motherboard. Right? Then you can actually see those traces. So you have the peripheral component interface, Express, that's the PCI, and the version, those are the expansion slots. So the ones that are the 5.0 can give you up to 63 gigabits per second. That's very, very fast. That's how much data you can acquire from these expansion slots, the express ones. And some of them come in PCIe by 1 that contains a single lane of data. The ones by 4 lanes, by 8 is 8 lanes, by 16 is 16 lanes, right? For example, a graphic card can use PCIe by 16 slot and may require up to 450 watts. That's a lot of power that a graphic card needs. You know, sometimes a tower with all the power supply in it can only handle, or it may come with 450 watts. So if you are building a new system for yourself, make sure that you get, and you want to, you know, have a good fancy graphic card in there. Make sure you have the power supply that can give you lots of power, because those graphic cards consume a tremendous amount of power. Okay. All right, then you got the, so we talked about the MCIs, the Molex connectors. Those are the power connector that looks like this. So here's a Molex power connector. You should be familiar with them when you see them. All right. So what else? A 4-pin Molex connector or SATA connector connects the power cord to the power supply. All right, now let's talk about the, what is this? The riser card. Okay, so when you install an expansion card in this riser slot, the card is going to be parallel to the motherboard. So it's not going to be outside. So this way you have less space. Okay, now let's talk about the other ports or connectors. Here's a whole bunch of different ports that are integrated into the motherboard. All the electronics of all of these ports, the DVD-I, the HDMI, the USB ports, all are part of the motherboard. All right, then you have the, okay, so here's a whole bunch of, let's talk about the SATA. Okay, SATA stands for, please write this down, SATA, Serial Advanced Technology Attachment, or sometimes we call it Serial ATA, connects the power cords from the power supplies to the power connector type you find on a graphic card. I'm sorry. That's not what it is. SATA is an interface standard used mostly by storage devices. So this is mainly the SATAs, the Serial Advanced Technology is for to connect to hard drives or even DVDs and things like that. In the old days, we used to have the integrated drive electronics, IDEs. This was used with the old, you know, in the old motherboards. An IDE connector has 40 pins and uses a wide ribbon of 40-pin connector in the middle of the cable to connect to another cable. So those are no longer used. If you have to deal with IDE drives, you probably should upgrade your system. All right, then you got the universal serial buses that can give you very fast speed. Now, almost all devices connect to one way or another to a USB drive, to a USB port. Let's talk about the BIOS and the UEFI setup. Okay, write this down. First of all, let's get the acronyms out of the way. BIOS, which stands for Basic Input Output System, and the UEFI stands for the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. So what is the BIOS and the UEFI? There's a core device drivers. A device drivers is a programs that run the hardware on your system, such as your keyboard needs a program. It's called the device driver. The monitor, the memory, everything needs one way or another a device driver to run. So the core device drivers, the most important device drivers, are all punched up and placed in the BIOS in the old days. But now we have a UEFI, which is an enhancement of the BIOS. So the UEFI, write this down, is an improvement of the BIOS, and it is backward compatible to the BIOS. So if you even have an old if you have an old system, the devices, it'll be able to work with the UEFI. Microsoft will require you to have UEFI for Windows 8 or Windows 10. So you cannot install Windows 8 or Windows 10 on any computer that does not have a UEFI. Also, EUFI is required if you are going to install anything larger than 2 terabyte of hard drive. And it offers you secure boot, which is very important. Very, very important. Now, that's why Windows requires it, because now, the operating system will not boot unless the operating system is digitally signed, which means there are encryption keys to make sure that that operating system is legit, and it's not just it has not been tampered with, so you don't get malware booted up when you do that. All right, so that's very important to write down. Also, to access the UEFI or BIOS, it all depends on what type of computer you have, but most likely you can either press F F12 or F2 or the delete button. All right, so one of the first thing you could do is go in and change the boot options. For example, when you want to boot up from Windows, boot Windows from a DVD, or you can boot from a server in a LAN. You can boot a Linux operating system from a flash. You would have to go into the BIOS to do that. So you press F12, go in there and make your changes. Also, let's talk about that's configuring the boot options. You can do the boot priority, secure, manage the secure port. We talked about that. Configuring onboard devices. So, number one, you can enable and disable. That's something important to remember. Please write this down. You can enable, disable wireless LANs, Ethernet network ports for wired ports, in other words, USB ports and video ports. You can enable and disable all of those in the BIOS or the UEFI. That's number one. Number two, you can do overclocking, which means you're running the processor, memory, motherboard, or video card at higher speed than what the manufacturers recommend. I really do not recommend you do that, though. All right. You can do power on passwords. That's number three. All right. So this way you can prevent the unauthorized access to the BIOS setup. The problem with that is you can't forget that. So if that ever happens, you're going to have to really clear the whole BIOS settings and start all over, by probably removing the battery. You may use LoJack. If you have a laptop, set up the LoJack, so in case your laptop is lost, we can locate it. But you have to pay a fee to an agency to enable you to do that. Okay, so we'll stop right here. We'll continue with this on the next video. So please write down what I asked you to write up and upload it. And we'll finish this chapter on the next video. I'll see you then.